Well, greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a special TenX Strategies webinar today on the subject of donor advised funds. And I am so pleased to have my old friend and dear colleague, former colleague, Peter Lipsett with me. We worked alongside each other for a number of years at the Koch Foundation and Koch Companies Public Sector and the Seminar Network and various names we had. And then for the past 10 years, Peter has been at DonorsTrust, which was formed in 1999 as a donor advised fund. He could tell us a lot more about that, but Peter is well known, I think, to many folks who are joining today's webinar. He's very active in the free market, conservative liberty movement, and is the chairman of America's Future, is on the board of directors of the Thomas Jefferson Institute for Public Policy in Virginia, and is just an all-around great guy. Peter, welcome today. I'm just going to kick it off right away. What is a donor advised fund, and why should those who are joining today's call be interested in this subject?
Well, that is a great question. So a donor advised fund, I like to think of it as like a charitable savings account that you have the dollars that you know you're going to be charitable with anyway. So let's say you're going to give away $10,000 this year. You donate that to the donor advised fund provider, like a DonorsTrust, which is a C3 itself. So you get a tax deduction right then. And then you have those dollars kind of set aside to be charitable with over time. That could be the next day, the next month, 2 years from now. The timetable is flexible than, say, a privation, and we can go into those other contrasts. But bottom line, it is a tool for being able to be charitable, to give in a way that is simple, flexible, tax advantage, other benefits. And that's the short story. Go much deeper than that.
All right. Well, I think those who've been in the development space for years have seen some of this stuff. Sometimes it's an unexpected or surprise gift from maybe a donor advised fund at Vanguard or Fidelity or Schwab. And then DonorsTrust came onto the scene. Those may also be familiar with the Bradley Impact Fund. A lot of institutions themselves will set up donor advised funds around particular donors. Tell us why don't we start with the history of DonorsTrust? Tell us a little bit about it and where it is today, and then we'll pivot that into the here and now with how this broadly affects folks who are on the call today.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways that it matters. And my Zoom is telling me my internet is unstable, so just like wave your hands frantically if I start getting a little blotchy there. But so a couple ways that the donor advised fund can be helpful for the people on the call. One is people who are using a donor advised fund tend to be a little more strategic in their giving, and what that signals to you is just these are people who are smart, savvy, they know what they want to do. And second to that, a corollary to that is it means they probably have some resources set aside to be charitable with, that they are probably thinking a little bit longer term. Where that really matters, and where this is a big deal, and we saw this a couple years ago, is people who have a donor advised fund can be a real saving grace in a recession, in a downtime, or at a time when you're asking for more in a capital campaign, because people with a donor advised fund probably have some extra dollars squirreled away for bigger gifts, for longer term gifts. And so those are people you can turn to. We saw this in 2020 and 2021, where donor advised funds really were a rainy day and helped a lot of nonprofits get through those hard times. We saw it again 2008, 2009, and that recession as well. And it also matters because depending on the donor advised fund, it can be a partner in a lot of ways. You can find a like-minded community. So you mentioned DonorsTrust, you mentioned Bradley Impact Fund. For those in the liberty space, that is the world we work in, and we want to see those types of groups succeed. If you're a Christian organization, you know of groups like National Christian Foundation or the signatory of other donor advised funds that are more evangelical. Jewish donors often are using Jewish federations. And then you've got the big commercial ones that don't really have an affiliation. Those are a little harder to match up in terms of somebody's ideological alignment. But if you see a donor coming from one of these public or the more mission-driven donor advised funds, it tells you a lot about them, and you can know a little bit more kind of what they're aiming at.
Well, let's back up a little bit. So most giving, charitable giving, at least in the United States, happens by individuals rather than by foundations and corporations. They're each a percentage, but the vast majority is done by individuals. And a tremendous amount of individual giving is done through individuals' discretionary income. They make a decision, I'm going to send $100 to this organization, or I'm going to send $1,000 to this organization, or whatever it may be. But you mentioned the nature of donor advised funds so backing up a little bit further, those who would be maybe very generous and charitable and philanthropic and wanted either to set aside some of their assets or accumulated assets to give more to charity might have started a foundation, maybe a family foundation or private foundation for giving. But donor advised funds came onto the scene and provided an alternative, which involves a lot less paperwork, a lot less restriction and regulation, but also is a very powerful tool of dealing with appreciated assets, but also can preserve donor intent. So why don't we walk through the steps of that? Let's say that I decide that I want to give charitably for the next 10, 15, 20 years, but maybe I just sold my company, or maybe just had some kind of appreciated asset. I don't want to give it all away now. I don't want to start a foundation. So if I wanted to give that to a donor advised fund like DonorsTrust, how would that work?
Yeah, great question. And you're right. I mean, the use of the word asset is an important one, right? Because we can talk some more about this later on in terms of what are some of the opportunities, but people with donor advised funds, that's an asset, right? They're not giving out of cash flow. They're not looking to be like, how much can I afford to give you? They've got it set aside already. So take the example of somebody selling a business. That's a great example. Some kind of wealth event where you're right. They look on the time horizon of, if they're trying to do it right now, here at the end of the year, they may want to be charitable. They may already know they want 20% of the proceeds of that business sale to go to charity, but they don't want to rush that decision. And so they can put those dollars into the donor advised fund, donate it to the donor advised fund, get the tax deduction, have that, technical piece checked off and done. And then once the busyness of selling the business kind of calms down, they can assess the landscape and say, these are the charities I care about. These are the ones I really want to give to. These are the ones I want to experiment with. Or if they're working with somebody like a DonorsTrust that understands that landscape, can be a bit of an advisor as well, and say, who's doing good work in this, and have that conversation and test it, and have many years of dollars set aside so that they can make those gifts. Same with appreciated assets, same, the stock market being what it is. Many people have assets that are bigger than they were. And, who knows what's going to happen with the tax situation next year. We'll know, I guess, in a little over a week, but they can donate those, write it off. Again, have a bucket of money that's longer term to be able to donate and maximize the tax benefit. And the important piece there is by giving these appreciated assets like stocks or real estate, you can actually put yourself in a position to give more than you otherwise would, right? Because you're not giving out of cash. You're giving this money that's almost forgotten about over in your stock portfolio over there. And so all of a sudden you can be more expansive in your thinking. And that matters to folks on this call as they're trying to figure out how to get donors to think bigger with them. The whole premise of everything you're doing, right, Kevin, to think bigger. Some of the assets that they might donate to a donor advised fund or could donate to you that are appreciated, allow them to think bigger with their giving.
Great. Well, you make a good point too, related to the heavily appreciated equity markets this year. John Von Cannon, the late John Von Cannon, who really led the extraordinary growth of the Heritage Foundation's development operation for years, well known to many people joining today's call, often remarked to me that people gave generously in a year of heavy stock market appreciation because they felt rich on paper, even though they may not have been necessarily cash rich, and would give more generously, particularly at the end of the year. I think that, first of all, is a note of encouragement to everybody who's listening today, that we're in that mode of the last 2 months of the year almost. And this is a time when many generous people will say, hey, I've got this heavily appreciated Costco stock or Apple stock or Google stock or Alphabet stock or NVIDIA stock or whatever it may be. And I don't want to pay capital gains on that. And I can't, if I won't receive that much benefit by selling it because of the tax, so I can give that away to a charitable organization, take the tax deduction for the full amount, even though the cost basis to me was much lower. And so I've been very able to be very generous. But rather than give all of that, whether it's appreciated stock or, again, the sale of a business or the sale of a home or property or something like that, you could actually, the charity could be a donor advised fund.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And make one contribution that turns in to 5, a dozen, 30 contributions, right? So it simplifies it for the donor and also simplifies it for the receiving organization that may or may not be equipped to take stock, certainly may not be equipped to take real estate or even business in a share of the business. If you're doing it before getting really complex and trying to donate part of the business before you sell it. Those are places where a donor advised fund can be a partner to you in helping to get that done for the donor.
All right. Well, we'll start simple. Let's say I'm in a very charitable mood this year and I want to give, but I don't want to. I want to give this year, but I don't know where I want it all to go. So I want to open an account at DonorsTrust.
Mm-hmm.
What do I need to know? What are the minimums? What would I do? Let's say I call, like, Peter, I just was on this call and you intrigued me. Can I set up an account at DonorsTrust? Is there still time this year? What would I need to do?
So I got a call yesterday from somebody, it was maybe 3 o'clock, and she's like, we want to set this up urgently. I know we probably can't do it today. I was like, well, the markets are closed. You probably can't wire it today, but we could have it up and running by the morning, right? I mean, setting up a donor advised fund is as simple as an application that's, fairly straightforward of who you are and what you want. DonorsTrust uniquely has room for a donor intent statement that we ask for the account to be open after you die, et cetera. But, those are details. And then making that initial contribution in. So if you went online, filled out our application, and then dropped a check in the mail for $10,000, which is our opening minimum, then you're up and running as soon as those dollars hit the bank account. And then you can begin to recommend grants out and do it. And different donor advised funds have different minimums. I think Fidelity, it was 5,000. Maybe Fidelity may have eliminated it altogether. But for whatever reason, Vanguard's 25,000, and community foundations vary a lot. The fees can vary a lot, but those are the basics. It can be really easy and quick to set up.
All right. So are you a 501c3 organization? What is your tax distinction?
Correct.
And
every donor advised fund provider is a 501c3. That's how you get the tax deduction when you put the money in for us. It also means we can only give out to 501c3 organizations in terms of the donation. So no C4s, no PACs, no candidates.
All right. So let me just speculate a little bit further. So let's say we all decide today as a group that we're going to start the TenX Strategies Webinar Fund at DonorsTrust.
Great idea.
And we're going to pool together resources and contribute over $10,000. Could we do that? Could it come from multiple people?
It can. We have something we call a strategic venture fund, which is a fund that, Kevin, you could be the advisor on, but you could invite other people to give into and say, I have one place that you can write a check to, but it's going to support these 10, 20 organizations that we're working with this defined goal. And trust me, I'm going to get this money out, put the money in, I'll report back on how it goes. So absolutely, you can do that. Some of the big bank donor advised funds like Fidelity or Schwab are a little less comfortable with that, but that's something that as a mission driven organization or community foundations are more likely to do.
Okay. And this is also a good way, I'm jokingly saying, we could have the TenX Strategies webinar group, but a family could do it. You could bring together sort of pooled resources and bring people in terms of common giving objectives and decisions. But let's say we started this account at DonorsTrust And a couple of people on the seminar on this webinar today contributed appreciated stock,
Mhm.
and you gave them, I guess, a receipt for that charitable contribution. So they're getting the tax deduction or the tax deduction receipt this year once they put the money into the donor advised fund, to the DonorsTrust account. Is that right?
Exactly. Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, they get the tax deduction as soon as it hits our account. We'll send them a letter and all that. And it could be, crypto stock. It could be real estate, fine art, all kinds of different things.
Okay. So let's say we've created this account, and when does it have to start giving money away?
So there's no rules. Unlike a have that 5% a year rule. There's no rules right now federally mandated on when those dollars have to come. And this creates some controversy, and there's certain aspects of people who think, well, they should be required, donor advisors should be required to give away X number of dollars. I think Fidelity has put some things in place to try to nudge people in that direction. If we don't hear from you for 3 years, we may say, hey, how you doing? Pulse still good. You're going to use this money at some point, but there's no rules on when it has to go out. Now, that, like I said, causes some people to say, well, donor advised funds are just warehousing wealth. The facts don't back that up. Most donor advised funds are paid out, fully cycled through within, I think it's 6 or 8 years. And many are much faster than that. So there are people who just use it as a tax vehicle, but it's got to go out to charity at some point. That's the thing. It ultimately
Okay.
has to go to charity.
But that is like a point of controversy for groups like Fidelity and stuff. They have these massive sums of money that are there that are not necessarily being given away. It's estimated, isn't it, like in the billions or even?
It is, but even when you compare that, if you say those people are going to set up a vehicle one way or the other, they were going to otherwise set up a private foundation where the minimum's 5%. They're generally giving above that, somewhere between 14 and 17%, kind of on average. And so giving out of donor advised funds is pretty good.
Okay, so let's go back to this hypothetical. We've created the TenX Strategies Webinar Group Community Fund, or whatever it is. We'll have you state the purpose, and we've got $25,000 pooled into it. And let's say next March, one of the officers of our little group reaches out and says, "I'd like to make a $1,000 contribution to the Thomas Jefferson Institute for Public Policy." How does that happen? What happens next? I mean, do they get to pick exclusively, or does the donor advised fund have the right of refusal? How does all of that work?
Yeah, so the right of refusal is an important one, right? One of the big differences between a private foundation and a donor advised fund is private foundation, the donor retains a little bit more control over it. With the donor advised fund, you are making an irrevocable gift, just like you would to any charity, right? That is why you get slightly better tax benefits with the donor advised fund than a private foundation. But the kind of wink in the nod of the donor advised fund is we're going to listen to you. You are the donor advisor. You have advisory privileges over those dollars. And yes, we could say no, and sometimes we do say no. Very often, the big banks will kind of give to anybody, although not always. We can come back to that. But something like DonorsTrust, we explicitly tell you when we're going to say no. We don't give to groups that take a lot of government money or work to expand the size and scope of government. Now, for most people, that's a benefit. That's not a hindrance. Different organizations are going to have different rules. Some community foundations may say you can only give within 100-mile radius of Des Moines or whatever it is. So they can set their own rules and follow them. I mentioned Fidelity not always following some of their more open-ended rules. There was several years ago a situation where Fidelity and some of the other ones, Goldman Sachs, were saying no to some conservative groups, to TPUSA, Project Veritas, Alliance Defending Freedom, several Focus on the Family, several others, because they frankly didn't like the politics. They muddled their way through some excuse, but at the end of the day, they didn't like the politics. They've backed away from a lot of that, which is good, because as we like to say, philanthropy is free speech. It is a way that you speak, and Fidelity was kind of quelching that. They kind of went against the gentleman's agreement of that. You should know what you're signing up for beforehand.
All right. Well, I got a few more questions, but I want to invite folks to jump into the Q&A or the chat. I'll monitor that and we'll go till the bottom of the hour, but really want to take advantage of this opportunity this time with Peter. He's got a lot of knowledge in this space. So Donors Trust is, as you say, an explicitly, we'll say limited government, free market, donor advised fund. You have your own statement of purpose or principles. Just tell us a little bit about that, and then who constitutes some of the we'll say accounts or members of the Donors Trust community. I know that there are a lot of folks on today's call who receive gifts from Donors Trust from particular accounts. How does all of that work?
Yeah, so some of you on the call, I think, were at the National Review Institute dinner a few nights ago, where Kim Dennis, who is our co-founder and still our chair, spoke, and she mentioned O'Sullivan's Law as kind of the reason that Donors Trust was founding. This idea that organizations that aren't set up to be explicitly conservative or right-leaning ultimately are going to drift over time. And that was happening at other donor advised funds, lots of big foundations. You had the Tides Foundation on the left set up to be explicitly progressive. And back in the late 90s, there wasn't a good conservative solution. So that is kind of the impetus for creating Donors Trust. And she and Whitney Ball put it together and started with one account, and it slowly snowballed and really has seen a lot of growth over the last 5 years or so as more people understand donor advised funds. But we were really explicitly built to work with donors who care about limited government, personal responsibility, and free enterprise, and want to advance that with their philanthropy, want to make sure their donor intent is protected. Now, about 60% of our grants go out to public policy organizations, like many of you on this call, but they also go to churches and to synagogues, to civic organizations, arts and education, and medical charities, et cetera. You can do all of that through the Donor Advised Fund, just within the parameters we mentioned. So that's kind of the history of it. What was part two of your question?
Well, now I've got all these questions coming in the chat, so we've got a lot of work to do. Let me ask you some of these questions that have been raised. The first is, can a nonprofit organization set up their own donor advised funds?
It can, and there may be a number of reasons that you would do that. So there's several, for example, a few groups in the state policy network, state think tanks, that as they have set up other additional groups or had a big initiative that led to working with different C3 partners, have set up a fund really as a way to simplify things for donors, so that they could walk into the room with a donor and say, we have this big vision. We are going to turn Pennsylvania into this bastion of liberty. We've got this group and this group we've set up. We're working with this group over here. We are asking you for $100,000 to support this whole idea. Write one check into this fund we have at Donors Trust, and then we're going to allocate it to where it's best needed at the time to make sure we can do this big vision. So that is certainly something that some nonprofits have worked with. There's also nonprofits that do grant making, but don't necessarily want that on their books. And so they can use the fund as a tool to give it out. Now, what you can't do, and this is really important because we do get this question, you can't set up a donor advised fund explicitly for the purpose of just creating a pass through. So, the America Institute, to make something up, actually, those are such banal names that it may exist. But the Free America Institute sets up a donor advised fund because they want an anonymous donor to be able to give to the fund and give to that institute as a one-off thing. You can't do that. That's not our rule. That's an IRS rule. But if the vision is bigger and you want to support other organizations, then absolutely, a nonprofit can do that.
All right. I'm getting lots of questions, not surprisingly, from folks asking, well, how does someone apply for a gift from Donors Trust? So, and that's kind of, I'm sure many times you feel like you're treated like a donor when you go to a State Policy Network event or others, or Kim Dennis may feel like she's treated that way. But really, do you ever recommend an organization to a donor, or is the donor pretty much making the recommendation to you and you're giving the check mark that it's an okay and fits the guidelines or principles, and then you process the contribution? How does that work?
So a little of all of the above, and this is going to vary again between different donor advised funds. So at Donors Trust, we sit in this nice place between the donor community and the grantees, and we have a universe of grantees we really care about, right? We give to lots of places, but the liberty organizations, the free market groups, the conservative groups, those are the ones we really care about. And so we spend a lot of time talking to those groups. We set up meetings with them to understand their wins. We actually do look at the emails that come through and see what's going on with your newsletters, et cetera, because we want to be well versed in what the landscape looks like, because donors do come to us and they say, I'm really worried about election integrity. I'm really worried about, we've passed all these ESAs, but what now? How are we going to implement it? They come to us with these questions, and frankly, we want to be able to answer them, to say, here are 2 or 3 groups that are actually helping to solve that. One thing we try very hard to do is kind of not pick winners and losers, right? Because just because 3 different groups are very different, have different approaches, one isn't necessarily better, but it might be better for a particular donor. And going back to the whole point, the whole idea behind DonorsTrust is really protecting that donor intent. And so we want to help match that up. Now, there is no magic pot of money. I'm sorry to say, I wish I had a magic pot of money, but DonorsTrust and most donor advised funds don't have their own discretionary grant making. Yes, we sponsor some things, we do some things like that, but we don't really have discretionary grant making. We did once back in 2020, we did some things around COVID. Those are few and far between. And so that's generally, you don't want to go to a donor advised fund, except for maybe community foundations. Community foundations, like geographic community foundations, can be a little different, right? Because they have programs to support different things that you can treat a little bit more like you would a private foundation. But the DonorsTrusts, the Bradley Impact Funds, certainly the Fidelities and the Schwabs and the Vanguards just don't have the resources to just be granting money out. But we do want to know what you're doing.
All right, I've got some rapid fire questions, and we may go a little beyond the bottom of the hour because we're getting a lot of questions. I'll let the folks, if you want to stay on, maybe go about 5 minutes longer. But here's my rapid fire questions as best I can grab them from the Q&A. What are the current assets at DonorsTrust? How much do you have given by various donors that you're managing those investments?
So we've got about $1 billion in assets. And last year we gave away 300 million, a little north of 300 million. We're on pace to do that, if not more, this year as well. Obviously, those assets fluctuate. Those could go down to 0 at any time, right? If somebody granted all of those out. So that's why we're always seeking new people. But the measure we really look at more so is how much money's going out, because that's what really matters. Money going out into the community of nonprofits.
Well, $1 billion is a lot more than you started with in 1999.
Yes.
So how do you handle, is there an investment committee?
We do have an investment committee, and we offer, if somebody on the call opened a fund, you could choose from several different investment options so that your money grows tax-free in the fund, which is nice. You end up with more to give away over time. Going back to that theme again, for accounts of $1 million or more, you can bring in an outside investment advisor. That again, that threshold varies at different donor advised funds, but that is something that's under threat right now with some proposed legislation with the IRS of whether those outside investment advisors are still going to be allowed. I don't think that's ultimately going to change, but that is something you can do too.
All right. Well, I want to touch on that before we close out, but a few more questions related to this. Roughly how many accounts are there at DonorsTrust?
There's north of 500 or so, and some
Okay.
come and go.
Well, you've been responsible for DonorsTrust marketing for a number of years, so congratulations for your good work and spreading the word and increasing the number of accounts. A number of folks have asked, well, is there a way to find out who some of the bigger accounts are, and I can go ask them for a contribution? How does that work, Peter?
That doesn't work. It doesn't work. As Lawson Bader, our CEO, likes to say, we do not comment on the identities of our donors, real or imagined, because we have both. And so that is something that is a reason people use the donor advised fund, to create that, some of them, to create that additional privacy.
Now, since some of the accounts are just, in the name of a family or name of a person or what have you, but they also may have a stated mission. Could I come to you and say, I'm doing work in Western Pennsylvania on trying to lower state regulation that's affecting creating barriers to entry. Are there any donors at DonorsTrust do you think that might be interested in my work? Would you be able to answer that question?
We could answer the question and kind of understand what the organization is doing, and could go to the donor and say, hey, we met with this group that's trying to save Western Pennsylvania. Thought you might be interested in it. Here's some information on them. If it's of interest, if you want to make a grant, go for it. But we really leave it in their court when it matches up with their donor intent.
All right. So bottom line, donor advised funds are terrific for a donor who has some heavily appreciated assets in particular, who wants to give, be done with it, or maybe give because they're selling something now or need to sell or for whatever reason. And they may want to take the tax deduction in this calendar year, for example, but give it away over a set period of time. They may want to bring in family members to the giving decisions ultimately, things like that. Now, there is talk that there are some threats on the horizon, some new potential IRS rules. It always happens as any entity gains in popularity. Suddenly, the IRS wants to get more entangled in this. What are some of the threats that we should be conscious of?
Yeah, there's a couple. I mean, there was something called the ACE Act a couple of years ago, which currently seems to be dead, but like zombies, these things tend to rise up again, that would have put a requirement on how quickly money had to come out of donor advised funds, put some other restrictions around it, private foundations' ability to use donor advised funds for ways real and imagined on why Congress thought they were using them. And then there's some more IRS proposed regulations that the sector is largely uniformly against, that would, for example, limit the ability to use outside investment advisors, create some other definitions that don't necessarily make sense. There was a hearing 2 months ago, I think, that pretty resoundingly came out to tell IRS they don't know what they're talking about in a pretty conclusive way, and IRS is a little bit on its heels on that. The big question is, as taxes and tax laws change next year with the new administration, no matter what it is, what are those going to look like? How will donor advised funds get swept up in that? We'll see. There are some positive potentials too, like with a universal charitable deduction, being allowed to give into a donor advised fund would be a positive thing that may or may not be allowed. So there's just always a lot out there. I point people to the Philanthropy Roundtable in particular. If they're concerned about that legislative side, the Roundtable does a terrific job of tracking all that.
All right. Two final questions. One is, and you noted this earlier, if you're working with a donor and maybe they're going to make a 5 or a 10-year commitment to an effort you're doing, they're not ready to give everything now, but maybe they have some appreciated asset, and rather than they say, well, look, I'll just give it all to you now. Well, I'm not so sure about that. I don't know where you as an organization might be in 5 years or 8 years or what have you. I'll pledge this amount, but to ensure my intent is protected, I'm going to make this gift to a donor advised fund this year, and they're going to help administer that. Is that something that you might recommend to some of the folks on the call? You're working with a potential major donor, and it just may be the structuring through a donor advised fund may just really make it a whole lot more attractive.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to really get practical with the folks on this call who I know are, out there in the trenches talking to donors, the donor advised fund can sometimes look like a competitor, but really the donor advised fund can be a partner in situations just like that, right? And really, frankly, position you to be a hero to the donor for solving a problem that they have. So we've talked about selling the business and recommending them to a donor advised fund to be able to parcel that out. Maybe it's a donor intent concern. Either they don't think the organization will be there, or they're thinking about legacy and they're worried their liberal daughter and son-in-law are going to be directing those dollars one day, right? The donor advised fund, recommending a donor advised fund to them as a tool to make sure they can still support your organization and the other organizations they care about, and do something separate to support the daughter and the son-in-law. If there's a complex situation or a tax situation, all of these are places where you as the development officer can be listening and say, looks like you have a problem and maybe an obstacle to you getting the yes that you want. point them to a donor advised fund, particularly one that shares their values, and say, this is how you can solve your problem and still support our organization. And that is a great way to build the trust with the donor and build the relationship. Obviously getting good graces of the donor advised fund, you're sending clients their way, but to create a lasting revenue stream for you and a stronger relationship, just being able to point people that way and understand those mechanics can be a great asset as a fundraiser.
All right, Peter, I have one quick comment and then I have one final question for you. The quick comment for those who are asking about, like, is it possible to find out who the donors are that have donor advised funds? I would just counsel that's kind of sort of backwards way of fundraising. And that is to say, really, it's your offer in the marketplace, what you're offering as a solution to a problem, and the motivation of the donor, the charitable intent, how they contribute it to you, whether it's through a donor advised fund or a check or a gift of appreciated stock or whatever it may be, is something that you work out to them more on the back end, not necessarily the front end. Because at the end of the day, donors are looking to solve big problems. And if you're in the mix of solving a big problem in a very credible way, you're in the mix with them. And the donor advised fund becomes the solution, but I wouldn't turn it the other way around, if that makes sense. Well, with that, Peter Lipsett, thank you very much. What's your final parting advice to those who are on the call today? What's the one thing you would want everybody to remember as we break up?
So a twofold. And by the way, anybody's welcome to contact me, plipsett@donorstrust.org. You can put that in the follow-up, and always happy to chat. There's some questions I know that didn't get answered here. Happy to answer those. Two things. One, to your point that you just made, the donor advised fund can be a tool. If you're not tracking who gives to you from a donor advised fund, then do that in your database, not because, again, it's not a magical pot of money, but it tells you something about the donor and how they think and when you might be able to go back to them with something bigger. And then two, just you have an opportunity to be a hero to your donor in everything you do. And the donor advised fund can be one way that you can help solve donors' problems. And we at DonorsTrust would be delighted to help you solve those problems for your donors.
Well, Peter Lipsett and DonorsTrust, thank you. Thank the entity DonorsTrust and the directors and the supporters of DonorsTrust. But thank you, Peter, for being so helpful as always. And ladies and gentlemen, in the follow-up, I will put Peter's contact information if you'd like to follow up as well. Thanks again for joining us. We'll be back again soon and appreciate everything that you do. Thanks a lot.